Captain Theron Kalen traced the carved granite edge of his stark wooden desk, the silence of the underground office pressing upon him like the deep ocean's weight. Outside, far above the reinforced vault ceiling, the great city of New Seagate hummed its deceptive tune of commerce and order. The tang of the azure gulf, salt, coffee, and that ever-present scent of newly minted gold was muffled here, replaced by the drier, colder air of official bureaucracy. Theron, a man whose very posture spoke of unwavering discipline, felt the foundations of his ordered world begin to crack. The sickness, this creeping desiccation, was not the chaotic outburst of the streets he knew how to manage. It was a quiet, insidious poison targeting the silk-lined apartments of the Silken Strand. He knew the merchant council families, their wives hosted his mother for tea, their sons trained in the Citadel Guard rotation. To seal them off, to admit the Duke's favored citizens were dying of an unknown blight, would be to tear the opulent veneer from New Seagate, inviting political ruin. He pulled the brittle, aged sketch from his breast pocket, its edges soft from years of worried handling. Alara, her smile, captured in charcoal, seemed impossibly bright compared to the grey reality surrounding him. 5 years she had been gone, swallowed by the shadows of the sunken quay, that festering wound at the city's lowest point where the guard rarely ventured unless bloodshed demanded it. The official report spoke of 3 families struck in the Strand, but Theron trusted bureaucratic parchment less than he trusted the tide tables. The sickness had arrived with the sea dragon's folly asterisk from the chain of sighs, bearing those prized ether crystals destined for the alchemist's guildhall in the Obsidian Quarter. Biological or arcane, the difference mattered little when death arrived silent and dry. Theron's initial instinct, the duty ingrained since his cadet days, screamed for immediate lockdown of the Strand, the formal procedure to contain the visible threat. Yet, the cold suspicion burrowed deeper, if the source was the crystals, or if the true outbreak festered unseen in the quay where Alara had vanished, sealing the wealthy only delayed the inevitable catastrophe while sacrificing critical time for investigation. He needed eyes where his uniform was an immediate death sentence. He needed allies outside the rigid structure of the Azure Guard, and he needed them before the next dawn broke over the gleaming limestone towers. He rose, the heavy wool of his uniform feeling suddenly restrictive, a cage of regulation. He would not initiate the quarantine yet. Instead, he would begin his own investigation, starting with a carefully worded query to a source he hoped hadn't been compromised by the city's creeping decay, a source known for valuing discretion above all else. The ticking clock on the wall sounded less like time passing and more like a hammer striking stone, shaping the grim monument of his impending choice. Theron's passage through the upper citadel was swift and ghost-like. He utilized the old cistern tunnels, damp and smelling faintly of mildew and old mortar, paths known only to long-serving captains and the rats that were their only companions. His destination was a discreet, unmarked doorway behind a reputable, though often empty, map-seller's shop near the merchant district boundary, the known haunt of Mara Goldpocket, the hobbit rogue whose network of whispers spanned every tavern from the wharf to the spire heights. The air grew heavy as he descended, leaving the crisp, controlled atmosphere of the citadel for the humid breath of the city's underbelly. This journey, though only a few city blocks, felt like crossing a political chasm. When he knocked the agreed-upon sequence, 2 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 light taps, the door slid inward without a sound. The interior was surprisingly orderly for a den of illicit information. Shelves lined with exotic, lockboxes suggested wealth, and the air smelled faintly of rare incense, masking any less pleasant odors. Mara Goldpocket emerged from behind a screen, her eyes, bright and assessing, taking in Theron's imposing figure and the grim set of his jaw in a single, swift glance. She was smaller than he remembered, yet radiating a competence that belied her stature. "Captain Kalen, you look as if you've just personally supervised the execution of a holiday cheer," Mara murmured, her voice laced with dry amusement. She gestured toward a low stool. "What information requires the esteemed captain to soil his polished boots in my establishment? And more importantly, what is the price?" Theron ignored the jibe, placing a small, weighted pouch of gold, a sum large enough to warrant serious attention, small enough not to raise immediate suspicion if discovered. "The Sea Dragon's folly asterisk," he stated plainly. "It arrived 3 days past. Its cargo, ether crystals, went to the alchemist's guildhall in the Obsidian Quarter. I need the manifest's original route information, any unusual stops, and, crucially, who cleared its docking immediately prior to its demise. The official story is fever, but the crew looks drained. I suspect a transport issue, not a crew issue. I want every detail the harbor masters tried to sweep under the tide." Mara's amusement vanished, replaced by professional focus. She swept the pouch toward her and began arranging small, carved tokens on a velvet mat, a focusing ritual. "Ether crystals. High value. The Guildhall is not known for sharing its secrets, Captain. This smells of more than a simple fever. If this truly involves the Duke's supply lines, the risk allowance triples. The dead men on the docks are one thing, interfering with guild contracts is inviting a duel with entities far more dangerous than the Duke's Chamberlain. She paused, looking up, her gaze sharp. The initial port clearance was handled by a dock supervisor named Rorick, a man known for his insatiable gambling debts. He's indebted to the Iron Skulls syndicate operating near the quay. If I want clean information on Rorick, I have to send someone down into the bilge where the syndicate holds sway. That takes time, Captain. Time you may not have, given the 3 dead families you are trying to keep quiet in the Strand. I can give you preliminary Guildhall gossip by sunrise, but the key deep dive will cost you 3 days, and I'll need a promise of absolute discretion from your end if my operative runs into trouble. Theron nodded curtly. 3 days was 3 days too long, but the sunken key was a darkness he dared not enter without a guide who knew how to survive its shadows. He had committed to the search for the source, and Mara was the key to unlocking the lowest door. Sunrise in New Seagate was usually a brilliant affair, the pale limestone structures catching the golden light off the azure gulf, a sight meant to inspire confidence in commerce. But on the 3rd morning since Theron met Mara, the light felt thin, washed out, like weak tea. He had spent the intervening 48 hours navigating the political minefield, keeping Master Hemlock, the guard physician, occupied with spurious reports about a supposed minor outbreak near the fish markets, a distraction that bought him time but frayed his nerves further. He had learned from Mara's whispers that the Guildhall was quiet, too quiet, and that the initial batch of crystals had been secured in deep, magically warded vaults immediately. Mara's operative, a wiry, quick-footed hobbit whose name Theron never bothered to learn, returned just before the dusty afternoon light began to fade. The report was chilling. The sickness was not localized to the quay, but the quay was its cradle. The Iron Skulls, expecting a shipment of illicit spirits or perhaps weaponry, had found only corpses delivered in secret barges, the crew of the Sea Dragon's Folly *, dumped unceremoniously near the most squalid lodging houses. Furthermore, several residents known for their persistent coughs and consumption had reportedly succumbed to the dry death overnight, their bodies vanishing before dawn, spirited away by unknown parties, likely to hide the extent of the contagion from the city authorities, or perhaps, from the syndicate itself. This solidified Theron's dread. If Alara remained in the quay, she was now likely surrounded by the unknown vector. Duty warred violently with paternal terror. He could not send official guard patrols. They would either be turned away by the syndicate or, worse, bring the contagion back to the Citadel barracks, dooming the hundreds of guardsmen under his command. He made his decision. He stripped off his Azure Guard livery, donning the dark, simple leathers he wore as a younger, less burdened patrolman years ago. He armed himself sparingly, a sturdy short sword, a heavy cloak, and a concealed dagger, relying on stealth over open confrontation. He bypassed the barracks entirely, heading directly for the lesser-guarded western gate that fed toward the industrial and low-caste districts. Entering the sunken quay was like plunging into stagnant water. The air was thick with the smell of brine, refuse, and cheap, burning oil. The sunlight of the upper city never truly reached this place. The towering warehouses cast perpetual twilight. The sounds were muted, not the clang of industry, but the shuffling of worn feet and the low murmur of desperation. Theron moved with the practiced silence of a predator, relying on Dalton Fellwinter's old ranger training for awareness. He sought out the dilapidated hospice Alara was rumored to have used, a structure leaning dangerously over the black water of the slips. He moved slowly, noting the faces, hollow-cheeked, desperate, but not yet bearing the milky pallor of the dying. He approached an elderly woman huddled near a sputtering fire barrel, offering a small, clean ration of dried fruit. "I seek lodging that was once run by a young woman, Alara." "Long ago," he murmured, his voice rough. The woman looked at the fruit, then at his face, suspicion warring with hunger. "Alara," she rasped, clutching the offering. "She tended the sick, stranger. But they all leave here, eventually. The fever takes them, or the syndicates take them. No one comes back up to the sun." Theron felt a cold dread clutch his heart. The quay was not just housing the dying, it was actively hiding them, or worse, disposing of them. The second day of his unauthorized investigation brought Theron to the Obsidian Quarter, a district dominated by the imposing, smog-stained edifice of the Alchemist's Guildhall. This was the locus of the Duke's arcane ambition, a place where the line between science and sorcery blurred into profitable grey areas. Theron knew that confronting the guild masters directly, armed only with suspicion, would result in his swift political execution. He needed an opening, a weakness in their formidable front. Mara, true to her word, provided the wedge, a recently dismissed, disgruntled apprentice named Fendrel, who was now drowning his sorrows in the lowest taverns, muttering about unstable shipments and unauthorized crystal reactions. Theron located Fendrel near dusk, the air in the Obsidian Quarter acrid with the metallic tang of processed reagents. Fendrel was a wreck, but beneath the fear, a spark of professional pride remained. Theron presented himself not as a guard captain, but as a concerned, quality control agent, sent by a rival noble house concerned about the Duke's investment integrity. He offered Fendrel a substantial sum, paid out of his own considerable personal savings, to gain access to the Guildhall's intake logs for the Sea Dragon's Folly * crystals and any associated waste disposal manifests. Fendrel, terrified of the Guild's power but even more terrified of debt collectors, finally cracked, agreeing to meet Theron at a seldom-used ventilation shaft bordering the Guildhall storage area 2 nights hence, when the moon was weakest. However, Theron had not acted entirely alone in his need for muscle and expertise outside the guard structure. Recognizing the potential for confrontation in the shadowy dealings necessary for this investigation, he had anonymously retained Dalton Fellwinter. Dalton, the gruff, pragmatic mercenary whose reputation for efficiency in the field was legendary, had arrived in New Seagate under the guise of seeking contract work, though his loyalty was silently pledged to the captain who paid well and demanded competence. Dalton, utilizing his ranger and thief skills, scouted the ventilation shaft Fendrel had proposed. Dalton viewed the world with a practical, cynical eye, making him the perfect counterpoint to Theron's duty-bound anxiety. "It smells wrong, Captain," Dalton observed during the brief, hushed meeting in a rented, anonymous stable loft the next afternoon, the seasonal sunlight barely penetrating the dusty skylight. "The Guildhall guards are too lax near that shaft, suggesting they don't fear intrusion there. But the air venting out smells like ozone and old rust, far too clean for a waste vent. If this is a plague, it's an arcane one. Fendrel is your entry, I'll be the shadow that ensures you leave with your skin intact. If the guildmasters move against you, I draw their attention toward the docks, far from the citadel. We allow no official quarantine until we know what we are fighting. My oath is simple, competence earns trust, and trust, Captain, is something I rarely give." With Dalton securing the flanks and Fendrel promising access, Theron felt a perilous surge of control. He had official pressure mounting from the Silken Strand representatives demanding action, but now, he held the key to the Obsidian Quarter's secret. The next evening promised a convergence of danger, infiltrating the Guildhall while simultaneously tracking the trail leading down into the infected darkness of the Sunken Quay, where Alara might still draw breath. The appointed night arrived, not with the expected drama of thunder, but with a suffocating, stagnant stillness characteristic of the lowest parts of the port. Theron, leaving Dalton to manage the periphery near the Obsidian Quarter, a necessary distraction should the Guild sense trouble, descended once more into the Sunken Quay, following the trail of hushed movements Fendrel's information provided. He found the hospice, the structure leaning like a drunken sentinel over the black water, moments before the pale, sickly dawn could bleed over the horizon. The place was deserted, save for the residue of quick, desperate packing, a small, empty crate smelling faintly of disinfectant herbs, and scuff marks indicating heavy loads had been moved. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a familiar, soft voice whispered from the shadows of the damp pier beneath the hospice, "Captain Kalen. Is that truly you?" It was Anya Meadowsweet, the gentle townsfolk known for her apprentice herbalist skills. She was pale, her usual kind composure strained. Beside her stood Sarah Meadowlake, the journeyman healer, her face grim, and Gemma Fairweather, looking wide-eyed and terrified, clutching a small lantern that barely cut through the gloom. They had been investigating the missing residents of the quay, drawn by their empathy when the local charity stopped receiving new patients. "Alara is safe, for now," Sarah whispered quickly, cutting off Theron's panicked question. She realized what the sickness was. It wasn't truly contagious * in the typical sense. It was airborne residue, perhaps from the crystal refining process, but only potent in areas with poor ventilation, like the quay. The afflicted were being moved, not by the sick, but by a small, organized group seeking to hide the true toll. Anya nodded, her small hands trembling. "They weren't hiding them from the guard, Captain. They were moving them to an isolated warehouse further down the coast, ostensibly for specialized treatment. Alara went with them, trying to help. She discovered they were not healers, but agents of the Guildhall, containing the contamination where it originated, the dock workers who first handled the Folly *, and silencing any witnesses who knew the crystals were volatile." The full truth hit Theron with the force of a breaking wave. The Guild wasn't just supplying the Duke, they were covering up a dangerous failure in refining the ether crystals, moving the victims to cover their tracks before the official inquiry. The sickness was a symptom of industrial sabotage, not a plague. At that very moment, a faint, sharp crackle echoed from the direction of the Obsidian Quarter, Dalton's signal. He had engaged the Guild's external security. Duty and personal crisis had merged. The danger was not contained in the quay, but in the greed of the Obsidian Quarter. Theron took Anya's hand, steadying her. "You three are to return immediately. Alert only Master Hemlock that a severe industrial contamination is active in the coastal warehouses. Tell him the Azure Guard cannot be seen, he must coordinate civilian aid discreetly. Mara will cover your trail." He looked out toward the Seagate where Dalton's fight was beginning to draw attention. "I have a rendezvous with my hired muscle and a score to settle with a collection of avaricious alchemists. The facade of New Seagate is about to be washed away by the tide of truth, and I intend to be standing on the shore when it breaks. He secured his coat, the last vestiges of the pampered captain replaced by the determined investigator ready to face the light of day, however harsh it might be.